an original.
From Story Studio Network.
I'm Dave Trafford.
I'm Erin Trafford. Welcome to this episode of Canadian Forestry Can Save the World.
This is the podcast series where we explore the role the forestry industry can and does play in fighting climate change.
And in this episode, we're going to take you all the way back to episode 2 of this season.
We learned the number one source of carbon emissions in Canada is...
Fire! Fire! Run for your lives!
Forest fires. Yes, they cough up more CO2 than all the emissions that come out of the smokestacks and exhaust pipes right across the country.
The emissions this year, CO2 emissions, Natural Resources Canada estimates that this year they'll be from wildfires around 2 gigatons. So to put that in perspective, that's 3 times our national greenhouse gas emissions that are actually reported in terms of fossil fuels and human induced.
2 gigatons. That's 3 times the amount from fossil fuels.
So even if we were to miraculously eliminate all the fossil fuel emissions right now in Canada, we'd still have a carbon crisis because of emissions from wildfires and forest fires.
Now, we don't normally do this on this podcast series. We usually try to include 3 or more voices in the show or the episode to talk about the subject at hand. But in this case, we're going to focus on a rather provocative conversation we had with Jamie Stephen.
My name is Jamie Stephen, and I'm the Managing Director of Torchlight.
Now, Jamie Stephen has been banging this drum for some time now. He's the founder of Torchlight Bioresources and an expert in bioenergy and decarbonization strategies.
Now, he will tell you that forest management in Canada is the key factor when it comes to fires and reducing our carbon emissions.
A large part of this is how we manage our forests and where they are in their cycle.
Now, for all the attention the federal government has spent on the climate crisis, there is next to no attention being paid to tackling the emissions from forest fires.
We are putting almost no money into trying to reduce wildfire risk. We spend some money fighting wildfires.
And based on the Fed's own numbers, the fire emissions rank among the top source of air pollution in this country.
We are the highest emitters in the world if you include wildfires.
And when Jamie Stephen crunches those numbers, Canada's carbon emissions per capita are a problem, to say the least.
If you compare it to another boreal country, which has lots of forests, Sweden, in this year, we will have 100 times the per capita greenhouse gas emissions of Sweden.
So, question, what do we do?
Well, let's assume the status quo is not the answer. We can't just leave things as they are and somehow hope things get better.
Yeah, you might qualify that as willful ignorance.
We can just let it be and continue along this pathway, and we will have, on average, more and more greenhouse gas emissions and more wildfires.
Okay, so let's take that off the table as a workable option. What else do we need to consider?
Invest in active, climate-smart forestry, active management where we're going in on a regular basis to reduce wildfire risk, and then using that material for bioenergy.
We've spent a lot of time in this podcast talking about using the whole log, use the whole tree. It means deliberately and purposefully making use of as much of the wood as possible that's harvested from the forest.
On average, about 45% of the tree will go to make lumber. But we've also heard how the wood chips and what might otherwise be considered waste is now being used to manufacture things like mass timber and engineered wood products.
And we've heard some really interesting discussion about turning that scrap into biofuels, the wood pellets. They're used for heating.
Heat that generates energy to run sawmills in the bush.
It can be energy that can also be pushed right back to the electricity grid.
Also energy that supports the kind of district heating network they're testing in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia.
And remember, we learned in an earlier episode that Quebec requires forest management companies in that province to actively salvage usable wood after fires roar through a forest.
And a good deal of that wood product can be used to manufacture biofuels.
But that's not all.
The third option, which from a climate perspective is the idealized option, is to do bioenergy with carbon capture and storage.
We've touched on it briefly in a previous episode. Using climate-smart forestry to mitigate fires and manufacturing biofuels is a decent step. But we can close the circle when we introduce the whole BECCS process.
BECCS is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage.
It's bioenergy carbon capture storage.
This is where you're taking the CO2 emissions that are generated from bioenergy and you're permanently putting them underground.
And the idea is pretty interesting. Rather than releasing the emissions into the atmosphere, the carbon is captured and vented through an exhaust stack that runs underground.
This is where you're purifying the flue gas from combustion. You have pure CO2 and you inject it 1.5 to 3 kilometers below the surface of the earth.
Yeah, we're talking way underground, as in kilometers underground.
And there's a certain elegance to the carbon cycle and all the work the forest does in cleaning the air.
The tree grew, took CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then you put it underground, is actually a permanent carbon dioxide removal.
Once that carbon's stored underground, it stays underground.
To be clear, this carbon capture process can be also used at a plant running on fossil fuels. The emissions can be permanently stored under the ground.
When you're applying carbon capture and storage to fossil fuels, that's avoiding emission.
And that's obviously a positive. But now let's take it the next step. Remember, our objective is to transition away from fossil fuels. So, what happens if we run the plant or the sawmill on energy that burns wood product, that burns biofuel?
If you're using biogenic CO2, such as the CO2 produced from combustion of wood, because the tree took CO2 from the atmosphere and it drew it out of the atmosphere, that is actually reducing the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere and is therefore, in a way, reversing climate change.
All right, I'm following the bouncing ball here. The forest captures carbon from the atmosphere as it grows.
Check.
That carbon is released when we burn it to generate energy.
Check.
But that carbon is then permanently stored underground when we use the BECCS process.
Check.
So the net result is a progressive decrease in the amount of GHG in our atmosphere.
Yeah, it's reducing the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere.
Check. So why aren't we all over this?
Good question. We've already got the technology.
It is fairly early stage in terms of the industry development, but the technology is there. It's not, and it's just a matter of we've spent all this time focusing on one side of the carbon ledger, that is trying to reduce emissions, which is extremely important. But we also have to think about the other side of the ledger, the ability to have negative emissions.
And as we've learned, BECCS can reduce carbon concentration. Jamie calls it negative emissions. But this requires a major investment in new, innovative infrastructure to support a BECCS plant.
And here comes the other bouncing ball, because that means business needs to know where the ROI is, as in, show me the money.
To Jamie's point, the Canadian government has focused on reducing emissions, and the carbon tax, for example, has been a primary tool to make that happen. Now, we can debate whether that's working or whether it's, worth it at all. It's worth noting, though, that Norway and Sweden are way ahead. They're already setting up tax incentives that encourage the investment in BECCS plants. You contrast that with the mixed messaging we've had from Ottawa on the carbon tax of late, and that creates questions about the value of carbon. In turn, it creates uncertainty for companies considering any investment in BECCS technology.
Business has to know that carbon will have a value in the future.
We've heard from a few guests on this podcast, in fact, that are somewhat cautious about other tech investments when there's a question about the value of the carbon.
Whether it's the fossil fuel industry or the forest products industry, it is extremely hard to make investments if you don't know whether or not carbon will have value in the future. And that is why you're not seeing investment in carbon capture and storage go forward, because of what we call stroke of pen risk, policy change risk.
So it's pretty clear we really can't get to net zero if carbon doesn't have a dollar value. It means avoiding, reducing, or removing carbon from the atmosphere really has no dollar value.
The avoidance of CO2 emissions is the product.
So we know it needs to be done. We also know we have the tech. The question remains, what is the holdup?
Well, the holdup is simply government policy at this stage. I mean, as well-intended, it's not a shot, as well-intended as government and their policies may be, they often prove to get in their own way, and it slows things down, even when we're facing the urgency of a climate change crisis.
Unfortunately, some of the pathways that the federal government has identified as must-haves are not must-haves. And in fact, they're the unproven approach to decarbonize.
Give me an example.
Telling everybody to get a heat pump. This is not how the urban areas of northern countries have decarbonized. If you look at Sweden, Finland, Denmark, other countries that are in the north that are developed, if you go to every town, every city in these countries, they have a citywide, townwide district heating system.
We're shuffling our feet when it comes to things like district heat networks.
Yeah, we're well behind the Nordic countries in Europe on that score.
What we needed to do is to put, as soon as we started saying we are going to price carbon, is have a build-out plan for district heating systems in urban areas.
Now, the good news is there are a few locations, as we've noted, that are testing the idea of district heating, but still, it's a slow process.
Okay, so let's just think beyond the policy or even the politics that may be involved here. We've learned a lot from our conversation with Jamie Stephen. There's an obvious environmental benefit when we invest in carbon capture and storage. The benefit is amplified when we store carbon that's generated by biofuels. We can reduce emissions, we can avoid emissions, and in the best case, there is in fact a scenario where BECCS results in negative emissions.
Correct on all counts.
We've also learned BECCS presents an extraordinary economic opportunity for Canada. We can then export those emission removals in the form of credits.
This can be a massive export industry for Canada because it has three key things that many countries do not have. Number one, it has a huge amount of biomass. Imagine if that 2 gigatons of CO2 emissions, instead of going up into the atmosphere in wildfires, actually was permanently removed from the atmosphere. So we have a lot of biomass. Number two is we have the CO2 storage geology. That's critical. You have to have the right geology to store this permanently, and particularly in the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Northeast British Columbia, we have that storage and we know how to do this. And number three, you need rule of law, and we have rule of law. And I say this because obviously there's countries, or there's some other northern countries, namely Russia, that also have the other two things: lots of biomass, lots of CO2 storage capacity, but not rule of law. So we have those three things. we should be exporting carbon dioxide removals to other countries who do not have the first two things, lots of biomass, lots of CO2 storage.
Our forests and our geology, particularly in Western Canada, puts us at the center of this emerging export market. And it's all the better because most of the forest in this country is owned and controlled by our governments. We own it.
What we're actually doing is taking government-owned carbon in the form of trees and putting it into a government-owned storage space, right? It is almost like a service for the government-owned carbon, right? To be able to go from the forest, instead of going up in wildfires, to be put permanently underground. And that's why this is powerful, and that's why there's a massive competitive advantage for Canada in this.
And better still, Alberta's geology is second to none when it comes to prime conditions for underground carbon storage.
Alberta is probably the best place in the entire world to do CO2 storage currently because of the regulations.
So just think of it for a minute. Alberta, already the center of the oil patch in Canada, is the best location in the world for BECCS plants. That makes the oil patch the economic center that can drive our economic transition away from fossil fuels.
This is Canada's prime opportunity to turn the energy transition, climate change action, if you will, into something that actually creates jobs and economic development.
It addresses the question of how do we hit net zero emission targets without trashing the economy. This is an opportunity for Canada to lead the way, and the forestry and wood product sector is the backbone of that effort.
Now, before we go, I just want to circle back to Jamie Stevens' comments about the need and benefit of spending more money and attention on climate-smart forest management, because that's really where this all starts. Last year's forest fires, remember now, kicked out 2 gigatons of carbon.
Yes, 3 times the amount of CO2 attributed to fossil fuels.
So let's go back to the value of that carbon.
If we value them at the $170 a ton that the federal government says is the value of carbon in 2030, the emissions from wildfires this year have a value of $340 billion.
The emissions from the fires last year alone would be valued today at $1/3 trillion.
And that is 10 times our deficit.
Now, those numbers make it pretty hard to ignore the economic opportunity we're missing.
If you're as intrigued by and interested in Jamie Stevens' thinking around this, then you should absolutely go over and follow him on LinkedIn. He's a pretty prolific poster. And typically his posts are rather pointed and provocative, as you can imagine.
Yeah, it makes you think, and here's hoping maybe it may even make somebody act on this.
Well, thanks for joining us for this episode of Canadian Forestry Can Save the World. If you're listening on Apple, leave us a rating and a comment. Maybe you've got a question. Pass that along too.
For our producers, Becky Coles and Jen Hudson, our technical producer and audio editor, Mike Trutler, for Aaron and the whole team at SSN, thanks for listening. This podcast series is produced for Forestry for the Future. And for more information, I'd encourage you to visit the website forestryforthefuture.ca. And you may want to get involved in supporting a sector that's committed to growing a greener economy and driving our country towards a net zero carbon future for you and your kids. I'm Dave Trafford, and Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is produced by Story Studio Network.
This
is SSN.